Okay, welcome back everybody. Hope you had a good lunch, enjoyed it. And yeah, we head over to our next presenter. I'm very happy that he could come here to Switzerland. First wasn't sure if he can catch the flight, but now he's here and yeah, there's a lot of stuff now going on. So I'm very glad that he can hold the presentation and tell us something about Xamarin.Forms. So yeah, here's Mike James for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a terrible reputation for responding to emails. I'll turn them off for 2 weeks just because I need to go and write code or deal with other stuff. And so I agreed to come here, and they're all panicking because they're like, we haven't heard from you. And I was like, chill out, guys. I said I was coming. Just, yeah. So who here is a .NET developer? So a couple of you. There's not many in the room. Blimey. JavaScript? Whoa. Okay. Objective-C? Swift? Even less. Java? Wow. Well, Java developers, you're basically C# developers. Just uppercase it and you're good to go. So yeah, you basically know .NET anyway, so you're Xamarin experts. So who is this guy? Well, my name is Mike James, and I'm a program manager at Microsoft. But I'm also an evangelist at Xamarin. So Xamarin acquired Microsoft a couple of months ago, and I've kind of been given a dual role. So I'm kind of slowing down on the evangelism side and going more into program management, which is much more spreadsheets and emails and things. But I've got a couple of open source apps that are available on GitHub for you to download, all built with Xamarin, naturally. The first one, beer drinking. I'm British, so I love to drink beer. It's a rite of passage. And there's an app called Untapped. I don't think it's very popular over here. Anyone used it? So a couple of you. Yeah, it's built with Cordova. So it's basically the Antichrist to me. So I wanted to rebuild it, but natively, and I wanted to use Xamarin for it. So it's got an Azure backend, but I've gone through multiple backends. So if you go really far back through the history, you'll see that I used paths to start with. I switched to Convey, and then I also had a mobile service backend. We finally landed on app service. It's just for iOS at the moment. Android and UWP will come. It will probably go UWP first, and then Android next. Step counter for iOS and Android. It shows you how you can access some of the hardware features of these devices through C#. Dutch spelling is an app I built because I moved to Belgium a couple of years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, in order to drink beer. Let's be very clear. It wasn't for any other cultural reasons. I just wanted to go and enjoy some beer. So I moved there for 6 months. But before moving, I wanted to be able to speak the lingo. I'm not a fan of people who just arrive in a country and don't try and, learn the language as a minimum. I didn't want to be a British tourist for 6 months. So I got myself a Dutch tutor, and we would meet twice a week. I got myself a Rosetta Stone, and I decided to build this app so that I could practice my Dutch spelling on the way to work every morning. I did move to Belgium, as I say, but I moved to Brussels. Anyone know the primary language in Brussels? Well, hey! So that was a waste of time. And then we've got Hydrate, which is a Mac app that I built. And the reason I built a Mac app was because we had released Xamarin Mac, so you could build a native OS X application entirely from C#. And we sold a couple of licenses, and we had someone email in and say, hey, I'm getting rejected on the App Store. Have you guys actually tested this? There's a lot of head scratching. I'm sure it was tested, but we couldn't find a definitive answer. So it landed to me to build a Mac app that we could throw through the review process very, very quickly to confirm or deny whether or not there was a problem with the review process. So I built this in 20 minutes whilst eating a wrap from Tesco's. It was a delicious wrap, actually. The idea of this application is to have a timer that every hour gives you a native notification. So it uses the notification hub. So it just pings and it says, hey, you need to drink a glass of water. Now, the reason I include this one isn't open source because I'm pretty sure you all know how to hook into a timer event, and it's not too difficult. But I include this because it actually earns me more money than all of my mobile apps combined. Now, the reason for this is I didn't want anybody to download this application, so I charged for it. Because if you charge for mobile apps, no one downloads it. So I was like, this is a guaranteed way of no one using it. So I put it in the Mac App Store at 99p, which for a mobile developer is just pure greed. But for desktop software, that's a bargain. And everyone downloads it. So yeah, so it's well worth looking at the Mac as a platform to develop for, especially if you've built an application, Swift, Objective-C, Xamarin, it doesn't matter. If you've built an iOS application, you're about 80–90% of the way there to building a native Mac application because the API surface is so similar. Before I worked for Xamarin, I worked building or developing lighting control systems for things like the London Eye, as well as all of the bridges along the Thames, apart from Tower Bridge, which is the one that opens. That's controlled by a French company, and the lighting on it is horrible. But the London Eye looks quite nice, and the London Eye actually has two of these strapped to the outside of it, and it goes around all the time. They're solid state, it runs Linux, and we built the app that runs on it using Qt or Qt, depending on how you want to say it. So it's embedded C++, really fun to write, a good challenge. But the way you would interact with these, let's say you're at the London Eye, there's a control room right under the wheel with a big knob that you turn to set the speed, which is really fun. But they have a Windows 2000 computer in the corner, which connects to these controllers. Now they're on a Wi-Fi network, but the Wi-Fi is hidden. The password is London Eye, all lowercase, so it's super secure. And if you can get access to the Wi-Fi, you can control the lights on the London Eye. You can access a web page, which is just a list of buttons. And the buttons have the text for what it's going to do, like rainbow, solid blue, red, and we program different events and things. But the engineers would go into the control box, they would sign into the computer, and they would click on these horrible buttons, and then they'd go, okay, I think it's done it, and they'd pop outside, and they'd look, and they'd go, no, that's a wrong blue, back inside. And then they would tap on the button again, and then they'd go back out. It was stupid, it was crazy. So they said to me, Mike, can you build us a mobile app? We want to be able to do this from our iPhones and iPads. I was like, that's a super reasonable request. Who wouldn't want to be able to do that from their iPhone? So we were a cross-platform house. We didn't write apps in Objective-C. Swift wasn't around then. And I couldn't use Qt at the time. Qt 5 had just come out, so they had QML, but it wasn't running on mobile yet. And you still had to build your own version. They didn't release any binary, so you had to download the source and compile it yourself in order to get these Qt 5 features. All of our code for this stuff was built using Qt 3, which isn't compatible with Qt 5, which has the backward compatibility. It was a nightmare. So I couldn't use Qt. Now these controllers have a built-in web server, so I could host a website on the device itself. So that's what I chose to do. I built a web app using jQuery Mobile, and I hated every moment of it. I am a terrible JavaScript developer, just straight down, probably the worst in this room. And the jQuery Mobile at the time wasn't even version 1. So it was pretty buggy in areas, and it didn't deliver a great experience for the users at the London Eye, the engineers, and I hated developing it. And my boss said to me when we were approaching for the Olympics that he wanted me to repurpose that app for the engineers installing the lights along the bridges. So for the Olympic opening ceremony, David Beckham was being chased by a helicopter whilst he was in a speedboat. Does anyone remember that? A couple of you? So we programmed the lights to snap to white as he passed under them. Now we had no idea where he was. We only knew what time he set off, what the tides were doing, and what speed he would be traveling at. So we had to work out what time he would be going. And it's only the Olympic ceremony, and there's not many people watching it, so not too many opportunities for failure. But so they wanted this mobile app, and I was told, just repurpose the thing you built for the London Eye. And this was on a Friday, and I had really two options. One was to write a letter of resignation, because there was no way I was opening that project again. The code was horrible. The alternative was to find an alternative, to find another solution that allowed me to build a cross-platform mobile app with a little bit of sanity on my part, and it was purely selfish. So I went home on a Friday and I typed into Google .NET on iPhone, and it came up with Xamarin. And this is what I went, it's a really low quality image, and I apologize for that. But this is what I went back into work with on the Monday. This is my first ever native mobile application built in 48 hours for iPhone and iPad. I didn't know on that Friday that a UI button doesn't have a click event. I spent a long time with the IntelliSense just going, where on earth is click? It's touch up inside, if you don't know. I didn't know about UI navigation patterns or cell reuse, but I learned all of that by the Monday. And I went into work and I said to my boss, hey, have a look at this. And he kind of wheels his chair over, and I hand him my iPad, and he's playing around with it. And he's got a little bit of a wry smile. And he says, this is a native app, isn't it? I'm like, yep. It's like, well, you've wasted your weekend. You better load up the JavaScript project. And I was like, hang on, Simon, let me just show you something. And I showed him the code, And he's like, this is C#. I was like, yes, it is. And I explained to him what Xamarin was, and I showed him all, and I was top boy for about 6 weeks, and then I handed in my resignation and started work for Xamarin. So, there are multiple ways to build apps. You can use a siloed approach, which is a pretty expensive way to develop an app, but what you get at the end of it is a really great user experience. If you want a 5-star quality app, this is a great way to go. But as I say, it's expensive because you're going to reinvent the wheel for each platform you're targeting. So if we say you're interested in iOS and Android, you would use Objective-C or Swift as your languages, and you'd probably use Xcode as your IDE. If you're interested in Android, you're probably going to use Java. There may be a few of you that will use C++ if you're hardcore. And you'll probably be using Eclipse or Android Studio. And then finally, if you're interested in Windows Phone, is anyone interested in Windows Phone? 1, 2, 3. So I guess you guys own Windows Phones. Yeah, there we go. So if you're interested in Windows Phone, then you're going to rewrite your app again in C# and use XAML, and you'll use Visual Studio. You're probably going to have 3 different CIs. You're not going to be able to reuse your unit testing. It's madness. But if you want to build a really big team and have a huge headcount and your budget really isn't an issue, say you work for a company like Microsoft, perfect approach. Now, the alternative to that is where you can reuse almost all of your code, normally around 100%, sometimes a little less if you're adding custom features. But you have this black box where you throw in some JavaScript, some Lua, it really doesn't matter, and out the bottom comes an app. You'll get it for iOS, Android, and sometimes Windows Phone, but it's the lowest common denominator. This is an approach that I always suggest if you don't have any competitors, because your customers can't go anywhere else. So just ship anything. Just make your lives easier. And this is going to be the easiest way to ship a mobile app. There's no question of it. But in terms of the user experience, it's lacking. It's not great. So at Xamarin, we say you should be able to share the code, which is the whole pro of using hybrid and JavaScript and all of that. You should be able to share a minimum of 75% of your code across iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. But you shouldn't have to sacrifice that native UI and that native user experience. So we say shared C# core or F#. Any F# developers in? Not even one. They are an endangered species. If you see them in the wild, do take a photo. Everything you hear today in the realm of C# works with F#. Are there any VB.NET developers in? One. Very brave to say it. Most people are too ashamed to admit it. We kind of support VB.NET. If you want to know how we support VB.NET, grab me later and I'll explain it to you in detail. But the tooling isn't perfect. But F# and C# are first-class languages in the Xamarin world. So you've got your .NET core that you can share everywhere. And then you build once for iOS using storyboards or zibs. You build your UI again for Android using Android XML. And then finally, if you want to hit Windows, you would use XAML to build your UI layer, which is normally around 25% of your app. So you have the shared core, 100% API access. So every single API that the Objective-C and Swift developers and Java developers have access to, we get access to within C#. So just like when Microsoft release a new product, be it WinRT, HoloLens, Xbox, and they give us some new APIs that's built on top of the base class library, we know that it's really easy to get started with this. It's just some new APIs that we need to learn, and then we'll be masters of this new platform. Well, we've done exactly the same for iOS. So we have the base class library and all of the classes that we know and love. So a lot of your existing .NET code, if you've got any, there's a lot of Java developers in, you can convert. There are conversion tools out there to convert from Java to C#. And in fact, there was a customer called Frank Kruger. He is a genius. He just churns out apps all the time. He actually got Roslyn, which is the compiler service that Microsoft released, which is now backing Visual Studio and Xamarin Studio. He got that running on an iPad. So I can write C# applications on my iPad Pro. And I can debug it as well. It's amazing. Where was I going with that? Yes, so just with the one-to-one mapping, we have every single API that you would expect, but all through C#. Now, you know of private APIs in the world of Apple? Apple have private APIs, which are APIs that they explicitly tell you, do not use these APIs. If you use these APIs, we will detect it in the review process and we will instantly reject your application. There's no if, buts, or maybes. You will be rejected. You'll have to remove these API calls from your application before we'll reconsider it to go into the App Store. Now, Objective-C users and Swift users will sometimes try and sneak in a couple of private APIs because they want to do something a bit dodgy. And it normally gets caught, and then they go onto Reddit and they moan about the fact that Apple's walled garden and they're too strict. Well, if you want access to these private APIs and you want to experience an app rejection, you can do it from C# as well. So when I say you really can access every single feature that the Objective-C and Swift developers can, it's true, even the private ones that you really shouldn't. And the same is true for Android. So if you've ever built an Android application, you can probably just bring it straight over to Xamarin. As I said before, for the most part, we can just uppercase a few bits and it will just run because the APIs are so similar. I want to talk a bit about performance because performance is really important with mobile. For desktop, performance doesn't really matter. You know, turn the computer on, you can open up an app and you can go to the water cooler, get some water, or you can go and get coffee, and you know, you're just killing time. Mobile devices, you tend to just pull out of your pocket when you're waiting in Starbucks, you're waiting for the barista to make you a cup of coffee, and you want it to be speedy. You don't want to be waiting around for ages. Now with Xamarin, there's no performance loss. There can be sometimes a performance gain. So there's two parts of the performance story. For iOS, we have to do ahead of time compilation. We're not allowed to do JIT. We're not allowed to JIT on the device, which is how a standard .NET app would run. If you're running on WPF or a WinForms application, it's JITting. So just in time compilation. We do the ahead of time compilation, which is a rule by Apple. So by the end of the compile process, we get a native ARM binary that you can't tell the difference between if it was built with Swift or Objective-C or Xamarin. That's not quite true. If you open up the Xamarin app, you'll see some DLLs in there, but it's still just an ARM binary. On Android, we can JIT, so we do. Now, you can do ahead of time for Android as well. It's just a checkbox within the build properties in Visual Studio or Xamarin Studio. But most applications that are built with Xamarin, as of today, will JIT on Android. Now, for iOS, we come out faster than Objective-C, but we come out slower than Swift. So we sit kind of slap in the middle between Objective-C and Swift. And we're talking milliseconds here, fractions of a millisecond, in fact. So there's no real performance gain or loss to be had. No one's going to say, oh my goodness, your app performs so much better. Did you swap out Objective-C and go with C#? No one will ever say that. On Android, we are faster than Java. Again, it's fractions of a millisecond, so no one's going to say, did you replace all the Java with C#? But when we benchmark it, we will consistently come out ever so slightly faster. Now, naturally, we come out slower than C++, but that shouldn't shock anybody. Does that shock anyone? Good, that's what I like to see. So iOS has over 33,000 different APIs. And Android has over 40,000 different APIs. And that's a lot of APIs to learn, especially if you want to be a real cross-platform developer. So I completely understand why people like libraries like Codebase and things like Xamarin.Forms, because they abstract a lot of the differences in these APIs away. But it's really important to understand, at least at a basic level, some of these APIs in order to do some customizations with your app and eke out the best performance and best UX of your application. So we have two approaches with Xamarin development. We have the traditional approach, which is what I've been talking about. Minimum 75% code reuse, 25% unique to each platform, and you have that one-to-one access to every single API that the Objective-C and Swift and Java developers have access to. And then we have Xamarin.Forms, and Xamarin.Forms is an abstraction above that. But I want to talk about traditional first before we jump into Xamarin.Forms. Because when you hit the limitations of Xamarin.Forms and you're like, I want to customize this, I don't like the way the buttons look or the navigation bar looks, or I want to change the fonts for the whole application, you're going to need to drop down into platform-specific APIs. And that's just developing your code in this traditional way. So I want to show you very quickly traditional. Now, there are some pros and cons to traditional development. The biggest pro is a UI designer. We have a storyboard designer and an Android designer built straight into Visual Studio. So you can just drag and drop to create your user interface. So it's very visual. So if you're a visual person like me, this is the best way to create your user interfaces. Very, very easy to access every single platform API. There's no abstraction and nothing getting in your way. And because it's C#, we've got IntelliSense. I think of C# as a .do language. I hit dot and it gives me a list of everything I can do. So we get full IntelliSense with every single API available to us. And it's 100% native UI, so we get 100% native performance. Now there is a con. Maximum, you're going to kind of peak at 80 to 90% code reuse because you're going to have that layer at the top that's a UI layer that's unique to iOS, Android, and Windows. And we don't support XAML. Any XAML developers in? No one's written any XAML before. 1, 2. Okay, don't be shy. I'm not going to ask you to come up and demo it. It's not a quiz. So I want to show you traditional within Visual Studio. Are we all using Visual Studio? Oh, there's really not many. Xamarin Studio? Other? And the rest of you have just come for the coffee. Perfect. So this is one of my favorite resolutions to present in, because there's no way you would miss anything. So this is Visual Studio. If you don't know it, it's a pretty neat IDE. It's been around for a little while. And when you've got Xamarin installed, which comes installed with Visual Studio, if you just go ahead and say, I want everything, it's going to download like 1,000 gigabytes worth of stuff. But what you really want is just a cross-platform mobile, and you'll get Xamarin installed for free. And then you get these extra solution templates. So we have iOS. You see we've got tvOS as well, if you want to build a TV app for the new Apple TV. We can do watch apps, and we've got Android as well. Now we're going to choose iOS, and we'll go iPhone. App 6 works for me. And we'll load up the storyboard designer. Now this is the same format that developers writing Swift and Objective-C are using, this storyboard. So if you've got an existing app built with Objective-C or Swift, we can just drag and drop that storyboard straight into Visual Studio or Xamarin Studio and carry on. We just replace the code behind, so all your view controllers, with some C#. Now as I say, this is a pretty difficult resolution to show you things on, because the iPhone is much, much larger than this screen size that I'm presenting on. So we're going to have to zoom in and out a fair bit to get this to look good. So we'll go to the toolbox. We have every single control that the Objective-C and Swift developers have access to, and we can create custom controls. So if I inherit from UI button and I override a draw method, it's going to be available to me within the toolbox. I can drag and drop that onto the view controller or onto the view, and it's going to render for me live within the designer here. So I can then go ahead and change the drawing code, hit build, come back into the storyboard, and it will redraw how it's going to look within the storyboard designer. So I don't have to then go ahead and deploy to device or to the simulator to see what it's going to look like. So we're going to do something super, super simple. We're going to add a button, and we're going to add a label. And you're probably thinking that there's no iOS device that is a square, and you'd kind of be right. Watch OS is based on iOS, and that's a square, but it's not iOS. Now, the reason we're designing on a square is because Apple wants us to think about devices that aren't pixel perfect. So they want us to make sure that our apps work beautifully on the small 4-inch iPhones all the way up to the iPad Pro. We shouldn't have to create separate user interfaces for each device size that we want to target. So we use something called auto layout. Now, this is an Apple thing that we've implemented within Visual Studio. And what auto layout means is that our UI will look great across every single device because it will shrink and it will resize, it will move things around depending on what device size we're on. So this label, right now, I want to have it anchored to both sides, and I want it anchored to the top. Now, the thing with auto layout is it can be pretty difficult for people to get started with. It's very easy to get errors in auto layout. It doesn't matter what technology you're using. If you're using auto layout, the first few times you're going to get it wrong. The best bit of advice I can give you is every single control within your view needs 4 things. It needs an X, a Y, a width, and a height. If it's got those 4 things, you've got a valid auto layout. If it's showing orange anywhere, it probably means you've missed off one of those key essential ingredients. So you'll see when I start to add auto layouts to this control, using these little handlebars. As soon as I drop this, it's gone orange to say, whoa, there's something wrong with this auto layout. It's only got one of those 4 properties. Now a label's a little different because it can infer its height from the text size. So I don't actually have to worry about its height in this example, but if I wanted to, I could go ahead and set its height there. Now it's still showing me a invalid auto layout. So I think I've missed off. There we go. So I'd missed it off. Now it's valid, it's gone blue again. Now I want the button to be stuck at the bottom. So I'll get the little handlebars again, I'll stick it down here. And we see the little dotted lines to tell us this is how it's going to render on device. So if I was just to deploy this now because it's an invalid auto layout, this is how it's going to look, which isn't how I want it. I want it to stick to both sides. Depending on how big the view is, it will just resize appropriately. So I'll use a handlebar again, boom, click over here, and I'll set it a fixed height again. So let's select the label. Now I learned to program with WinForms, so I have the strangest naming convention for probably any iOS developer, but this is going to be LBL something. And this is going to be BTN click. Boom. So in Xcode, if I wanted to get to the click event of this button, as a .NET developer, I would sit there and just keep double clicking on a button and hoping that it would get to the code behind. And what it's actually going to do in Xcode, it's going to allow me to set the title of that button. If I want to get to the code behind for the button or the touch up inside event, what I need to do is bring up the split plane, bring up the view controller for the currently selected view in the storyboard. I then need to select the button, control click, draw a blue line over to the other file, drop the blue line. It will come up and it will say, is this an action or an outlet? And then I go, what the hell is an action or an outlet? I Google it, I find out I want an action of touch up inside, but it's not ideal. So we fix that. So within Xamarin, you just double click and boom. We go to the touch up inside event because that's what we expect. Now, because we're just a one-to-one mapping, actions and outlets still exist within Xamarin, but you don't have to worry about them. It's done for you. If we come into the designer file, which is generated for us, you can see we've got some outlets, which is my LBLs, and we've got an action of the touch up inside. So it's all generated. Actions and outlets still exist within Xamarin. It's just we hide it from you a little bit, but you can still get access when you need to. So we're going to do something super simple. So we're going to say LBL something dot, and then we get a list of every single thing that's available to the Objective-C and Swift developers. And you can see like CG size, that's an iOS class, UI text alignment, but we want text. Hello world. It really doesn't get much simpler than this. In fact, let's go even more exciting. Let's say this dot view dot background color equals UI color dot cyan. Let's get rid of that. And now we're deployed to a simulator. And it's going to build our application. And then it's going to launch, or it's going to fail. I know why it's failed. So one of our genius release engineers changed a default property to turn our linker off. Now a linker is really important because if you don't have a linker turned on, it's going to ship the entirety of the mono runtime with your app, which is like 24 megs. So my Hello World example is going to be like 25 megs of an app, which is a bit bloated for what we want. So we want to link away, get rid of all the bits of the iOS SDK and the mono SDK that we're not using. So I'm going to turn the linker off, we're going to hit play again, and this time it's going to work. And I'm going to send another email to the release engineer going, why? So this is the iOS simulator for Windows. It's remoting from a Mac. You have to have a Mac somewhere on the network. People with better vision will be able to see where my Mac is. It's not physically here, but it is visible if you look carefully. That's all I'm going to say on that one. But we can see that the button is bang in the center, which is what we expect because it's resized appropriately. And if we tap it, the label's going to update. Now I've got a touch screen on this, a multi-touch lovely 4K display. Now, if I'm developing on a Mac, and I've been a Mac user forever, I had a G3 iMac, you know, the ones you could lick because they look so good. I had a G4, I had a G5, then I switched to the laptops. I've been an Apple fanboy forever, so I can't tell you how much it hurt me when Microsoft bought us. So I'm now on the PC, but as a Mac user, I couldn't use multi-touch without deploying to device. And when you deploy to device, you've got that ahead-of-time compilation process, which can take a while. Whereas with the simulator, we can JIT. So we do, and it's infinitely faster to deploy to the simulator. And now I can do all the multi-touch stuff on my PC. So I'm just going to finger it, and I'm going to, boom, there we go. Hello world, and it's changed to cyan. And I can do multi-touch with this, and if I've got map views, I can pinch and pull, and it's just lovely. So that's our iOS simulator. That's traditional, the one-to-one mapping to every single API. Xamarin.Forms. So 75% code reuse sounds pretty cool if you're coming from Objective-C, Swift, or Java. If you're coming from JavaScript, that sounds pathetic. You're like, 75%, we should be 100%. Well, Xamarin.Forms gets you pretty close. Now, the marketing team at Xamarin would love for me to tell you that it's 100% code reuse. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they've printed that, but they're technically wrong. They're also kind of right, but they're technically wrong, which is the best kind of wrong. So, with Xamarin.Forms, we can get you to around 97% code reuse. And I say 97% code reuse because that other 3% is unique. There's code in the projects that's unique to the platform in order to get Xamarin.Forms initialized. You don't have to write that code. There's normally about 2 or 3 lines per platform project that's unique. We write it for you. So in terms of the code that you write, it can be 100% code reuse across iOS, Android, and UWP and Windows Phone. But when we analyze it as a solution, it'll always come out, best case scenario is 97% code reuse. So how do we get that high? Well, we abstract this top 25% layer. Most mobile platforms have pretty similar features. They've all got buttons, they've all got list views, they've all got maps. But the APIs that we use to instantiate these and control them are very different depending on what platform we're writing against. And there's no real reason for them to be different. So Xamarin.Forms abstracts away the differences to give you one consistent API that just maps down to the native implementation. So this isn't our version of what a button should look like. This isn't our version of what a table view should look like. These are still the native controls. It's just the code we're writing is an abstraction above it. So what's included with Xamarin.Forms? You get 40 pages, layouts, and controls, which you can build from code behind or XAML. Any MVVM developers in? A couple of you. For the rest of you, MVVM is just like MVC, but with more V's and M's and less C's. If you remember that, you've got it down. So because we subscribe to MVVM, we have two-way data binding. We give you a consistent navigation API, as well as a consistent animation API, a dependency service which allows you to get access to that one-to-one mapping. So although Xamarin.Forms is this high-level abstraction, when you need access to low-level features of each platform, you just use a dependency service to call down into it. So you're not stuck at this high level, you can drop straight down when you need to, which is a really powerful feature of Forms. And then we give you a messaging center, which allows your view models and your code and different classes to communicate to each other without actually knowing anything about each other. So you can have very decoupled code, which makes it really easy to test. I love the messaging center. We made Xamarin.Forms open source in April, and that was the first thing I ripped straight out of Xamarin.Forms and threw into all of my projects, because it's just lovely. There are some pros and cons to Forms. The pros are 97% code reuse. It's 100% native, so you get really great performance, and it's a great UI. It supports XAML across all 3 platforms, so you can really write your user interface once, and it's just going to work across every single device. And it's very, very easy to get started with. Now, a big con, especially for me as I'm a visual person, there's no UI designer. You're just going to have to write the XAML by hand and then deploy to either the simulator or device. We do have a previewer, which I'll show you in a bit, but that's in preview. And it can be difficult to customize. You have to start using that dependency service and use something called a custom renderer to do the customization. And if you've never done traditional development, if you've never looked at the APIs of iOS or Android or UWP, this customization can be a little bit intimidating. So I always think of Xamarin.Forms as being super easy to get started with, kind of difficulty and complexities going up. So with with traditional, it's very linear. The more complex your app, the more complex the code's going to be. And then there's no surprises there. With Xamarin.Forms, you can build a pretty complex app quite far with almost no work on your part, and then all of a sudden you want to start that customization process, and it's going to shoot up, and in some cases overtake the difficulty of the traditional approach to developing a mobile application with Xamarin. So there are really pros and cons to Xamarin.Forms. I normally say if you're building a consumer-style application, you're probably going to find it easier to build with a traditional style. You're still going to get 75% code reuse as a minimum, but you're going to find it much, much easier to do the custom UI and get that 5-star user experience. If you're building a kind of data over forms style app or an employee app, then Forms is absolutely perfect for you. So you get some pages and layouts included. We give you content, master, detail, navigation, tabs, and carousel. The layouts, I'm really lazy. I tend to just use a stack. And if I'm feeling really adventurous, I'll put a stack view inside a scroll view. But that's about as far as I go, but you do have other options as well. These are the controls that we've mapped across all 3 platforms. And this will get you quite far. But the gap here isn't my inability to design a slide. This is where you can add your own. So there's a huge community around Xamarin.Forms. In fact, Xamarin.Forms is open source, so you can get involved and fix bugs and add new features if you want to. But you can also go onto NuGet and you can add controls that are missing and that you need, or you can go ahead and buy controls. So Sync Fusion are giving away licenses at Dev Days, and I'll mention Dev Days a little later, but there's going to be a Dev Day event in Zurich next month. Now they're giving away a $1,000 license to their controls, which works for Xamarin.Forms, which is pretty nice, just for attending. But I've also used Infragistics as well. So it's just one API, I can use it from C#, and I get beautiful native charting controls. So let's have a look at Forms. So we'll stop this running, and we will go basic beer. So Forms project, when you do file new solution with Xamarin.Forms, in Visual Studio, you're going to get 4 projects within the solution. You're going to get a portable class library or a shared project. It's a very heated debate within the .NET community of which approach you should take, shared code or portable class libraries. I can tell you now that it's portable class libraries. People who think it's shared code, they're just wrong. We want to put all of our code within the portable class library. The platform projects, the Android, the iOS, and UWP projects, we don't even need to worry about. Unless we want to go into customizations, we can just ignore these. So all of our app lives within this portable class library. Now, because I'm using MVVM, I have view models. So if we come into the search view model, and I should say this app goes off to a REST API, and I can search for beer, and it shows me the beer in a list, and I can tap on it and get some more information. Now, this is all on GitHub, so if you want to play with it, go ahead, and Xamarin's now free and included with Visual Studio, so you can literally just download this and start running it. I've even been so kind as to commit my API keys, so you don't even have to sign up to any services. Now, that's pretty consistent of me. I tend to leak API keys pretty much most weeks, and I never get around to invalidating them. So we have this command, search beer command, because MVVM, we're using commands. And we go off and we search BreweryDB using a library I wrote. And we have an observable collection of iBeer. We clear out the observable collection and then we start adding the beers from the results. Now, the reason we don't just new up a new observable collection is it wouldn't raise a did change event. So my UI wouldn't know that things have changed and updated. So if we come into the views for this search page, you'll see it's all in XAML. And we've got bindings, and it's lovely. So I just want to run this so you can see it. We'll get it started on iPhone. And whilst it's going on iPhone, this is the real version I'm working on. We'll close that. We want the demo one. This is going to be fun, actually. There we go. So here is the iOS version. And again, this is 97% code reuse. In terms of the code I wrote, it was 100% code reuse. they look different because it's the native UI for each platform. This is how we expect it to work. We don't want a pixel-perfect design across all 3 platforms because the users will hate us. It's the whole reason I don't like Untapped, because it doesn't matter that I'm running on an iPhone. The app still kind of looks a bit Windows Phone-ish, but also a little bit Android-y, and it's not very nice as a user. I want native user interfaces. So within here, I can then search for Castile, which is a nice Belgian beer, and whilst that's searching, we'll come in here and we'll also search for Castile. There we go. Now I'm on a tethered connection, so it's a little slow. My phone is at the back by the window to try and eke as much signal as humanly possible. But you can see we get the results here, and it's all lovely, and we can tap on the results. And it's grabbing that image, and you saw it was a little slow to pull that in. The reason it's a little slow is it's throwing that on a background thread and doing it behind the scenes for us so that we don't lock the main thread, so that the UI is still responsive even though we need to go and fetch these external resources. Now, I haven't told it to do that. It just does it by default. It goes, oh, this is an external resource. He's doing it from the main thread. That's not very good. Let's deal with that for him. So that's pretty nice. And I also have an Android version. Now, let's see if it works. So I tweeted just before we started this that I needed to restart my computer, and Microsoft decided to do an update, which was nice. And it appears to have broken a few things. One of them being casting from Android to PC. So this was working beautifully maybe an hour and a half ago. So what I'm going to do, I mean, it's a big device, but it's not big enough for us all to see. So camera. We're going to see me from my most flattering angle and backwards as well. It's like looking in a mirror. I'm simply going to search for Castile again on here. Right, I've searched. There we go, it's gone and got the result. So you can kind of get a feel for it. It's not ideal that we're having to look at it like an animal on a camera, but that's Windows updates for you. I should say this is the anniversary edition, so it's an internal Microsoft build. This isn't the one that's not leaked, but released to everyone else. It probably has been leaked already, to be fair. So that's Xamarin.Forms. You can see the UI is native for each platform. We've got the proper tab bars. We've got the UI navigation controllers on the UWP. UWP runs everywhere. It runs on the Xbox. It runs on the HoloLens. They haven't given me a HoloLens to demo with yet, which is a real shame. I mean, it would be terribly boring for you guys as I stand here just looking around, but it would be amazing. But this app will run on a HoloLens. It will run on the desktop. It will run on phones for the 3 people that have bought phones. So it's awesome. I love Xamarin.Forms, and we love XAML. So although you can do everything from code behind, be it F#, C# or VB.NET, the best way to build your user interface... Who knows? Who knows? I'll just mute it. I'm sure it's doing something bad. So we love XAML. So if you're building your user interfaces with code behind, what you can do really easily is mix up the implementation details with your UI. So it kind of becomes too glued together, and it's very difficult to then go and tweak your UI. With XAML, there's a very, very clear separation of concerns. So we love XAML, and we've got this Saml Previewer. Now, it is in the stable version of Xamarin, which I've got installed on here, but it's hidden. So if you want to use this preview in Visual Studio, you're going to go and have to find it. We will be releasing it properly with a button and everything. The designer team has been working on it. I saw it just a few days ago. But the idea of the previewer is that we can write our XAML on the left, and we're instantly going to see how it looks on the right, so that we don't have to deploy to the device or the simulator to see these changes. And we can just flick between iOS and Android to see what it looks like. So that's pretty neat. We also have native embedding. So the custom renderers that I mentioned earlier, to get down into the platform APIs, and when you're kind of limited in the controls, you want to add something a little bit different, you can now embed native controls straight into your Xamarin.Forms application without having to write much boilerplate code. So you can see here, this is actually in a shared project, so I'm not a fan of this approach, but it only works with shared projects right now. We think we can bring it to portable class libraries. But you can see here, if I'm on Android, we're just going to take a native Android control and we're going to inject it into our Xamarin.Forms view. So you're not limited in terms of what views you can add to your Xamarin application. So, there is a Dev Day event next month, 28th. There is one ticket available left. It's not just going to be a one-to-one awkward day of chatting with someone. But there is one ticket available. And the way you can win the ticket, or get the ticket, is you need to find the chaps walking around with this on their t-shirt, and I think you need to take a selfie with them and tweet it. I think that's the idea. Where is he? He's somewhere back there. Is that the idea? Yeah, he's too shy to say anything. Perfect. But that's how you can do it. And as I mentioned, if you come to Dev Day, just by default, you're going to get Sync Fusion, which is $1,000. And in Switzerland, that probably isn't a huge amount, but for the rest of us, especially in Britain with Brexit. So, any questions? No questions. I either did a really good job or I was terrible. You can find all of the code.
There is a question.
Oh, there was a question.
I just wondered that since Xamarin is basically running on Mono, might there be any Linux support in the future for this?
It's a really good question. I saw an email about us building for Linux earlier, so I should read that before answering. We support Linux kind of, in the fact that Mono Develop is developed by us. That's Xamarin Studio, in case you don't know. We rebranded Mono Develop to be Xamarin Studio. That runs on Linux. We have an engineer full-time that makes sure that all of our code runs perfectly on Linux. In terms of things like the designers and building iOS and Android applications, it's unlikely for the short term that we're going to support Linux, simply for the fact that we've only spent 6 months within Microsoft. Previously to the acquisition, we were 400 people. 175 of those were salespeople. We've got marketing, HR, and various other teams. When you find out how small our engineering team is, you'd be amazed. So supporting Mac, Windows, and Linux is a huge task. I don't rule it out, especially with the way that Microsoft's going. They're trying to bring everything to Linux, it would seem. So I don't rule it out, but right now it's certainly not on the roadmap for the next 6 months. But if you want to just build generic C# applications and you're building for Linux, so you want to use GDK Sharp, you can do that without any problems, and you can build console apps as well.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? I'll be about all afternoon, so if you want to ask me anything, then just come and grab me. Yeah. You can find all of the code on GitHub that you've seen today, and plus loads more. So if you want to download that beer sample and get it running on your Android device to see it not backwards, or my multiple chins in shot as well, you can do that. You can email me any questions you have as well if you don't want to do face-to-face at mike@xamarin.com or myjam@microsoft.com. So thank you.
You're just driving with hand luggage, I guess. Or
sorry?
You're just driving with hand luggage, or?
No, I've got checked-in luggage.
Then I give it to you.
Oh, amazing.
I had to ship it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.